أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
إن الحمد لله ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلله فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله ونصلي ونسلم عليه وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين وعلى أصحابه بجهدهم قام هذا الدين. We begin this khutbah after having reflected on the fact that it's Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala that guides us, and that those who are guided by Allah, they have the favor of Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, and those who are misguided, they can't guide themselves except with the help of Allah. And we send salawats on the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and on his family, and on those who came in the generations past, and by their sacrifice they worked to establish Islam. The focus of the khutbah today is to reflect on Surat al-Hajj, and to reflect on those causes that allow us to seek some empowerment, or those things that the Quran is teaching us as far as values and the understanding about the way of the world that put us in a position of strength. Usually, I like to reflect on the whole of the surah to get like a big picture view. That's my approach. And then I focus on one ayat, given the fact that the Jummah doesn't really give a lot of time to reflect deeply or much more than that. But the ayat in Surat al-Hajj that we will reflect on is the ayat in which Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala says, الذين إن مكناهم في الأرض أقاموا الصلاة وآتوا الزكاة وأمروا بالمعروف ونهوا عن المنكر ولله عاقبة الأمور. Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala, He describes those who He has given power to, subhanahu wa ta'ala. They have some characteristics of what they do when they're established on the earth. They have some characteristics of what happens when they gain power on the earth. That group of people is distinguished from those who create corruption on the earth. From those who, when they gain power on the earth, they destroy the sense of justice that the human being must have, and human dignity. Those who Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala establishes on the earth, they establish the salah, and they give the zakat, and they enjoin that which is good, and they forbid that which is evil. And then we're reminded in the ayah that the finality of the affairs of this world come back to Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala. Now it's extremely important that we remember those characteristics, because in the world today there's a struggle over who's going to dominate and what way of life is going to dominate. And we see this in and out. We see this in our neighborhoods. We see this in our families. We see this in the changes that have been taking place rapidly for the last 20 years or so. When we look at the environment of the surah, the chapter of the Quran, Surat al-Hajj, firstly, any surah from the Quran, we want to know what are the general characteristics. So if a surah from the Quran is said to have been revealed in Mecca, there's some general characteristics that it has. Those general characteristics, it gives you an introduction to understand what you're dealing with. If it's revealed, labeled as being revealed in Medina, it has another set of characteristics. And that's an easy way to study the Quran. Except that in this case, there's somewhat of a debate amongst the scholars with regard to whether it's Mecca or Medini, whether it's revealed in Mecca or Medina, because it has characteristics from both. Now the characteristics of that which is revealed in Mecca is generally that it's talking about the hereafter. Generally that it's talking about the oneness of Allah. Generally it's talking about perseverance for holding on to the faith. And generally speaking, when we talk about the Quran that's revealed in Medina, it's talking about the reconstruction of the community, maintaining that faith in the struggle and the challenges that come with opposition. There's no concept of hypocrisy in the Quran until you reach the Medini phase or the Medini phase. Prior to that, you're not really listening to too much about hypocrisy, right? So there's certain characteristics that you can understand about the surah of the Quran if you just kind of get a grasp on what does it mean that the Quran is revealed in Mecca? What does it mean that the Quran is revealed in Medina? So more interestingly, Surat al-Hajj was revealed right before going to Medina. It was revealed at that last point of the Meccan phase. So you know what was happening. You know that they had to leave. The companions in the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they were forced out of their lands. They became refugees. They had to take refuge in Medina. Anybody that has gone to Hajj and you've made that trip between Mecca and Medina, you know that that's not a 45-minute car drive. You know, that's not a 20-minute walk to the grocery store. You know, that's a journey in and of itself. And at that time period, there was no vehicles, there was no airplane, there was no air-conditioned bus. It was a struggle. So in that struggle that came in Mecca, that suffering for the deen, that was complemented with the struggle of having to migrate for the deen, right? And so we have to understand that by the time they're ready to go to Medina, there's already another migration which came before that. The migration that came before that is that the Muslims were taking account of themselves. They were coming to a conclusion that they were in an environment that was hostile. And some of them went to the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. They went to the leader of the community. They told them honestly, we can't handle this. We have to get out of this environment. Right? There's no sellout point at that point. You know, they're coming to the leader and they're saying this environment is too much for us. Right? And so the concept that took place there is what? that the leader understood the conditions of the community. He understood that they were at a breaking point. Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. So then, where did they take refuge? They took refuge in Africa. So when they took refuge in Africa, that began to pave the way for the possibility of Islam being in a completely different environment. And because it paved the way for Islam to be in a completely different environment, it gave a certain type of understanding. What is that understanding? That the deen of Islam is not the deen of a particular ethnic group. It's not the deen of the Arabs. That the deen of Islam is the deen of humanity, is the way of life of humanity. Now there's some issues that we have to bring to the table here. When they migrated to Africa, they left their culture, they left their language, they left their traditions and their environment. And they had to go into a new reality. And there was a similar migration that took place with Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam and his son Ismail. We know that Ismail is named to be the father of the Arabs, but he was from Iraq. He was from a completely different environment. So that shows then that in Islam, if you look at the story of Ibrahim, if you associate it with Hajj, he migrated, he and his son, from that environment in which the people have refused to come into the deen. His own family, his own relatives. He left his culture, he left his people, he left his land, and they went into a new land. And we see that that's the struggle of the prophets overall. That's the struggle of the prophets overall. And so the consequence of that is that the deen of Islam can never be equated with just one ethnic group. We need to have that clear, because we live in a time period in which there's an assault on Islam. And the assault on Islam has come by a lot of different ways. But one of the ways, especially in this time period, which Islam is being attacked, especially in the indigenous community, is the idea of completely associating Islam as being anti-African, as being anti the people, as being solely an Arab nationalist project. And that has created a lot of confusion, and it has reversed all of the efforts which came before. So all of the efforts which came before of the Muslims coming into Islam, they were migrating from their culture. They were migrating from a state of being deaf, dumb, and blind to come into the knowledge of Islam, to come into a new mind. And then we find that after that, the community began to respect Islam. We all know the power of Islam in the inner cities. We all know the dignity that Islam had. We all know the standing of the Muslim. The Muslim was one that was considered to be righteous. The Muslim was one that was considered to have a solution to the problems. And so what you see in the environment now, the retrogression, the violence in the environment, the breakdown in the environment, the breakdown in our people, is a consequence of us losing our ground and explaining what Islam is in practice. Right? We have the teaching of Imam Muhammad, rahmatullahi alayhi, the concept of a new Africa. This has not been realized to the degree that was necessary in order for us to preserve the deen. And where do we get that from? If you look at the lesson of the Muslims migrating from Mecca to Medina, it's necessary to have an environment which will allow us to practice, which will allow us not just to make our salah, but which will allow us to engage in collective economics, which will allow us to have a family structure which is intact. That's why we said, when the Quran is talking here regarding those who are the believers, they're described as those who, when they establish on the earth, when they have power, right? They establish the salah and they give the zakat and they enjoin the good and they forbid the evil. That reality of being in control of our environments, we have lost that idea as a people. And so what has come to the fore is that everybody's focused on themselves and their own development, their own economic development for themselves and their families. Even within families, individuals will just be focused on themselves. And this is the reversal of all the effort that came before. Not to mention the fact that people in the Muslim community themselves have come into the communities, and rather than work on the liberation process, they have worked on the process of corruption. And we see that in the corner stores, and we see that in the relationship that they have with the community. is one which has completely reversed the image of Islam as being for the people. And so on multiple fronts, the work that was done since the time of Elijah Muhammad to the time of Malcolm X, to the time of Imam Muhammad, to the present day, all of that work is being reversed. And then we have another issue. The other issue that we have is that the generation, the younger generation and the older generation, there's a complete gap between the generations. And like the civil rights leader, Dr. Oba Tashaka said, that in reality, there is no real generation gap. It's a trap. This is a cultural break that we have. It's not natural to say that there's a generation gap between ourselves and our children. This is a psychological reality that is in the minds of the generations, in which they say, well, we can't understand each other. No, we're not putting the effort in to understand each other. There's a deep wisdom in seeing that Ibrahim, alayhi salatu wasalam, migrated with his son. And his son took up the legacy. His son, the next generation, carried the banner of the deen. This is what we have to ask ourselves. From the children of the community of Imam Muhammad, who will carry the legacy? Who will maintain the masajid? Who will be working for the continuity of the deen? That should be the number one priority of the community with regard to survival, of bridging that gap between the generations. And so we see that in that surah, Surat al-Hajj, one of the things that we find is that in that environment, those people were displaced. Those companions of the Prophet Muhammad or his disciples, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they were displaced. So how is it that the Quran is addressing them? The Quran is directly addressing their psychological state. Because it appears that they were grieving because they were taken out of their land. It appears that they were grieving because they wanted to make Hajj. It appears that they were grieving because they were suffering the oppression and they knew that they didn't want to leave Mecca, but they were forced out of Mecca. After 500 something years, the people of the America are grieving being displaced from their lands. The indigenous people of the Americas are grieving this reality. And we see right now, even when you look at the situation, look at the Amazon fires, look at the fires in the Congos, we still are suffering displacement to this day. And this is directly connected to Islam. And we mentioned this in other places. Maybe most of you don't know. But the transatlantic slave trade came as a direct result of the fall of Al-Andalus. When Muslim Spain collapsed, the European powers decided to hit the next target and center of knowledge of Islam, which was in Africa, in Timbuktu. And this entry of these powers into Africa is what kicked off the slave trade. The Muslims were pretty much at the center. And up to now, we're still trying to find what is our identity. Many of us, whether it's in Latin America or whether it's here in North America, or like they used to call it, the wilderness of North America, many of us are still lost in trying to understand who we are. Because that knowledge was taken from us. That knowledge was taken from us not just through the processes of oppression, but it was taken out of the history books. And we have come to that knowledge today of how it was done. If we look, when the Muslims came into the Americas, before they came into this part of the Americas, when they went into places like the Caribbean, there were rebellions that were launched. Even when they went into Brazil, there were rebellions that were launched. And as a consequence of that, there was a Muslim ban to ban the Muslims from coming into the Americas, because the Muslims had a concept of justice and they had an understanding that the human being is not to be enslaved. That debate took place between Ahmed Baba and the scholars of Morocco, when the scholars of Morocco had compromised the deen with the French and betrayed their Muslim brothers in Timbuktu. And the Muslims don't like to hear these types of stories. They like to whitewash these stories, but the reality is that that is what happened. Just like there was a compromise between the Muslim community, those who came into this land, and they compromised their relationship to the indigenous community here. They compromised it so much that they reversed the job and the effort of dawah. And that's what was happening in West Africa early on. History repeats itself in cycles. And so that compromise led to slavery being associated with skin color, even in the Muslim community itself. And so when those who bring up to us that Islam is a religion of the Arabs, is that type of stuff that we're contending with. But if we ourselves are not the voice for Islam, if we ourselves are not the manifestation of Islam, if we ourselves don't continue the work of Islam, if we ourselves don't continue the liberation process, if we ourselves don't reach out to our communities, then that story will sit, and all of the effort and the sacrifice, the pain and the suffering that went before will just go to the side. And so the Quran, when it came to alleviate the heart of those who were taken out of their lands. We have to alleviate our hearts. We have to be in a position that this suffering that we're experiencing under this new regime, where a lot of the situation that we're experiencing now seems like it's in the time prior to segregation or in the 60s, is a time period in which there's a psychological war being waged on the indigenous community, so that the indigenous community feels emotionally collapsed. So the indigenous community, their trauma is reignited. And so the Quran, look at the methodology of the Quran. The Quran understood that it's possible for that community that was forced out of its lands to go through that trauma. So the Quran gives them the right of defense. If you look at verse 39 in Surat al-Hajj, the Muslims are given the permission to fight. Permission to fight has been given to those who are being fought because they were wrong. And indeed, Allah is competent to give them victory. The Quran didn't just say, have a positive attitude. The Quran didn't say, just have a positive feeling. The Quran said you have to organize. You have to protect your communities. You have to sacrifice and you have to struggle, or else you'll be in a situation in which you will be destroyed. And so we find that here, the second thing that comes to play in the environment is that there was a clear struggle for land. Quraysh wanted to take the Kaaba and turn it into a business center, much like Hajj today. 10,000 for Hajj, 7,000 for Hajj, 8,000 for Hajj. It's become a business center. Quraysh wanted to take that environment and capitalize it for their own interests, even at the expense of the people that were living in that environment. The poor, the women, those who were foreigners to that land. Everybody was in a situation in which they were suffering systemic injustice. That's why the message of Islam resonated with those people who were listening to the da'wah. That's why Bilal radiallahu anhu was one of those who was set to the community as an example of what the liberation of Islam is. Not because he was the muadhin, because Bilal, we know that he was the treasurer in Syria. This is one of the problematic issues that we have in the community, that we want to have these symbolic, non-power based, type roles that we give to certain people in the community, when that's not the reality of Islam. Islam, the message of Islam is coming to empower the people. And so one of the ways that it does is that it looks at the psychological conditions of the community, and it addresses that psychological condition. It addresses that psychological condition so that that person has a mind that has the capacity to stand as a man and as a woman of Islam. And so the Quran continues its address on three fronts. The Quran begins to address three groups. The people of Shirk, which is the Quraysh that have turned Mecca into a place of business and a place in which they don't allow the truth to dominate, because they know that it will undermine their economic interests. They know that it will undermine their positions. The second group, the wavering Muslim. The Muslim who is wavering. And the third group is the true believers. So for the first group, the people of Shirk, Surat al-Hajj in general is giving them an understanding that what they worship is not anything of substance. And secondly, that there's a fate, that there's a consequence for going against the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who Allah tabaraka wa ta'ala sent from their own people in their own language. So there's no divide between themselves and the messenger. That's why every community is impossible for another group to come and liberate that community. That liberation process has to come from within each community that comes into Islam. And this is the dilemma that we're in today's time. When we talk about the disruption of the work that took place from the time of Imam Muhammad to now, we see a psychological retrogression in the Muslim community, in specific in the indigenous community. And we see an identity complex. And this is something that was warned against, not to take on an identity which will not empower you, even to the point now where we have in the Muslim community itself, even among some of our brothers from the indigenous community itself, don't want to deal with the issue of race, don't want to deal with the issue of reparations, don't want to deal with the issue of systemic injustice. We're being taught that the morality of Islam is you just focus on your prayer and don't focus on anything, like you don't exist in the world, like you don't have to go into the world and go make money, like you don't go into the world and don't have to see the police run down the block, like the world doesn't exist. And that's a message which will completely reverse the reality of Islam, right? And so what we see is that the message to the wavering Muslims, those who are not prepared to endure the hardship, and in our case, endure the hardship of building a new Africa. There is a hardship that comes with continuing that vision. There's a hardship that comes when it comes to really doing the work. There's a hardship that comes when you're the one that's carrying the burden and you're alone. For those that waver, the Quran asks the question, are you okay in your Islam when you're in a state of peace and prosperity? Then mashallah, we're all the mashallah Muslims. But then when the heat comes, then the deen is discarded in the time of hardship. And so the Quran is saying that's not acceptable. It's not acceptable to have that type of wavering attitude about you, yourself, and your way of life. There has to be a commitment to yourself. There has to be a commitment to your way of life. There has to be a commitment to empower your community. If that commitment is not there, then you don't have the safeguards. You operate as an individual. And we fall back into the same problem that the companions fell into, that they were persecuted one by one, and they were forced to migrate one by one. Isn't this what happened in most of our inner cities? Each family is forced to migrate out one by one because they couldn't deal with the drug dealers on the block, because they couldn't deal with the violence in the community. So we're forced to flee. We're forced to migrate. We're forced to leave. We're forced to suffer the brunt of gentrification. We're forced to try to figure out where we put our children. We're forced to worry on a daily basis about our conditions of safety. Without the group and without the jama'ah, there's no way or ability to move forward. And so we, in order to get to that point, can't afford to have a wavering attitude. This is not an issue of age. This is an issue of commitment. If we have a wavering attitude, we ourselves will collapse, because the trials and tribulations of the environment and the time are many and are enough to collapse anyone in the process. That's why we're seeing suicide in the Muslim community. That's why we're seeing depression in the Muslim community. That's why we're seeing our brothers incarcerated in the Muslim community, because the mind is not correct. And if you have a community that has the experience of understanding the necessity of transforming the mind, it's not legit and it's not allowable for you to keep that to yourself. If you have an understanding that there has to be a process of change, a changing of the self, of resurrection from the death of the mind and the soul and the emotions and the sense of self, then that's the message that we have to continue to give until our people come into some sort of enlightenment. One of the things that Hajj Malika Shabazz said, rahmatullahi alayhi, is he said that what our people suffer, some of it is bigger than religion. Some people don't understand this statement. Meaning that all of our community is not going to come into Islam. But they're still from our people. They're still from our community. They still have rights over us. We still have an obligation. And so he said, from there, that's where he built his organization, to make sure that there was some sense of unity. And he had that vision that the Muslims would lead the projects of development, that the Muslims will lead in the process of addressing the conditions of the community. And that was the identity of the strong Muslim that was understood. That was the righteous person coming to teach. That was the poor righteous teacher in the community that was looked up to. And so we see that, that we gain some momentum from the Quran, that we have to be supportive of those who are wavering Muslims, those who are not sure where they stand until they come clear on their commitment. And then lastly, to the believers, those who have committed to the deen. The Quran acknowledges Quraysh oppressed you. Quraysh took your land. Quraysh bars you from practicing the deen. They stopped you from going to Hajj. The Quran didn't say, oh mashallah, just take it as the qadr of Allah. The Quran acknowledged that there is a real oppression that took place. And that in itself, for someone to acknowledge that there is a real oppression that's taking place, that's half of the battle that we have today. There's a term called gaslighting. And in the term called gaslighting, the person makes you think that you're crazy in the process. They abuse you, they use you, and then they make you feel like you're out of your mind. Now we have to realize that some of us are out of our minds. But we're out of our minds because really the reality that we're living is not one of sanity. The police brutality, the wealth gap, the incarceration rates, the disappearance of women. These are realities. You have to be a person that goes out of your mind in order to face and deal with that. And so the Quran comes, acknowledges the reality. There is oppression. You're not out of your mind in that sense. It's a defense mechanism. When our brothers and sisters are going to heroin, when our brothers and sisters are going to the bottle, that's a defense mechanism. We were told, and we didn't believe in the concept of divide and conquer. And we mentioned before that each individual goes his own route. This is exactly the problem in the family today. We didn't believe that the reality would continue. Slavery has no expiration date. This is the reality of the family today. The pitting of the women against the men, and the men against the women, and the men against each other. We all know that reality. But if we don't address that reality, it will continue another generation, and another 2 generations, and another 3 generations. This generation is well aware of what came before. But the new generation has no conception of struggle, of suffering, of sacrifice. They don't know what that means in the sense that you as a people know. And that's not to take away from the younger generation. But if the older generation doesn't teach the new generation that reality, to acknowledge what it is that's going on, not from a position of weakness, but from a position that from early on there has been continuous resistance. Resistance is in righteousness. Resistance is in cooperation. Resistance is in making sure that your marriage is maintained, but not just maintained for the sake of maintaining. Maintaining from the angle of understanding that we're in a process of destruction, and that we need to look at ourselves and what it is that we go through and what it is that are impediments in our relationships, and look at it as a revolutionary process. That when we transform ourselves together and we commit ourselves together, that's the key to resistance. With the family intact, then we're able to build the nation. And so the Quran takes us back. Not only does the Quran acknowledge that the Sahaba or the companions have been oppressed, but the Quran recounts the history of the Kaaba. That's the power of history. When you recount the history, 200 years is nothing in comparison to thousands of years. When you recount the history and you remember your collective history, you can come into a knowledge of yourself that puts the record straight. You can come into an understanding of what your role is in history and in the world. And when we look at Quranic history, that we're all the children of Adam. And that we, as the children of Adam, are brothers and sisters with distinct orientations and tribes, tongues and cultures. And the Quran doesn't give us a problem in that at all. To have a sense of dignity, each community to have a sense of dignity in itself. Each community to have a sense of respect and regard for itself. We don't see that anywhere. Matter of fact, in the Quran, it says, لَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ. That indeed, without a doubt, we have honored the children of Adam. So that the children of Adam carry themselves in dignity. The power of history is to take a hold of the story of who we are. And it's the same thing with the Muslim community. If we don't take a hold of our existence in the Americas and our role in the Americas, we shouldn't have to wait till somebody takes an oath on the Quran of Thomas Jefferson to say, yes, we've been here. We should have never doubted that from the beginning if we were teaching correctly. Because without that history, you have no place. The foreignization of Islam is to displace Islam from these lands. Islam is something strange. Those people, those outsiders that come. So that there's no roots. And the reality of Islam in the Americas is not just the African reality. We have people like William Webb. We have European Americans that were diplomats in Islam. And they were carrying on the work. If we don't fight for that type of identity, then we don't have a space for ourselves. We will always consider ourselves minorities. We will always consider ourselves marginalized. We will always consider ourselves as not having a right. And this is one of the reasons why the Quran is recounting the history of the Kaaba to displace the narrative that Quraysh said. Quraysh said a narrative, we're the owners of this land. We're the owners of this store. We're the ones that control this. We're the ones that have the right to this. But when the history changes, then we can have a right attitude and a sense of justice. And so we see that the Quran says, الَّذِينَ إِمَّكَّنَّهُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ يَقَامُوا الصَّلَاةِ وَآتُوا الزَّكَاةَ وَأَمَرُوا بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَنَهْوًا عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ وَلِلَّهِ عَاقِبَةُ الْأُمُورِ. The characteristics of the believers is that they have an understanding of the proper role of power. The society that we want is a society that is rooted in righteousness and brotherhood. Economic justice is a society which believes in encouraging what is good before telling people that they're wrong. Yani, amaru bil ma'ruf. Enjoy what is good first. We'll never be able to build our people if we just constantly condemn them for the issues that they have. No one would ever come into the deen like that. That's the type of da'wah that we do nowadays. We don't look at people as being redeemable. We don't look at the goodness in the people. And this is one of the PowerPoints. There was a video that was put out, that was done some time ago. It was recounting Mr. Farrakhan going into the community. And there's some brothers that are drinking. They don't look too together. And one of the success points is he goes and he shows that person themselves and their dignity in the midst of them being broken. That's why the nation was able to take people that are on heroin and crack and transform them. And that's why we have community projects that are getting $1 million grants and can't do anything to transform the community. Because they don't understand the secret of having to be recognized and loved by your own people. They don't recognize the secret of needing that type of support and that type of confidence. We don't need an evidence-based program that's looked at by a school of social work from any of the top universities in the community. We have the experience in the community itself on how to transform. But what has happened is that there's a gap between those who were doing the work and the next generation to come. And if we don't know that story, we will always look at ourselves as being foreigners in our own community. And that's the tendency of Islam, not only here, but that's the tendency of Islam also in Latin America, where the people that are indigenous, they come into their own communities and they have that experience of being foreignized. Like one of the elders in the Puerto Rican Muslim community said in New York, if you don't have a sense of ownership of your Islam, you will lose it. He came in from the Young Lords, which was the counterpart to the Black Panther Party. He says, if you don't have a sense of ownership in Islam, whether you are European American, whether you are African American, if you don't have a sense of ownership in Islam, whether you're a sister or a brother, you will lose it. Because you won't feel that it's you. You won't feel that it's your identity. You won't have a sense of pride in it. You won't have a sense of commitment to it. And so we see that the generation that the Quran built was a generation that had an understanding of who they were. And not only who they were as far as just being spiritual people, but who they are supposed to be as far as taking their role in history and in the world. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم في العالمين إنك حميد مجيد. In closing, we wanted to say that we really urge the community to work on this project of making sure that the experience and the knowledge of this community itself, this association itself, with this historical reality, not just that we're talking in symbols. Brothers want to talk in symbols. Imam Muhammad said this, we did this. We don't need that. We need the experience to be communicated. That experience, when it's communicated, will allow us to do the work. That experience in building community and organizing and being a model community and working with the people, when it's transferred, it will aid us with the older brothers working with the younger brothers and the older sisters working with the younger sisters, and us working with those from our families and our communities that are not Muslim, most of all. So we ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to guide us and to aid us and to help us and to protect us and to increase us in our rizq. And we ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to forgive those who came before us, Imam Muhammad and those who came before in their struggle for the deen. We ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to forgive them all of their sins and give them the highest levels of Jannah. And we ask Allah Tabaraka wa Ta'ala to allow us to die in a state of Islam. Aqimus Salah.